Hi everyone, welcome to Menopause. We're coming to you from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia at the amazing House of Owl. Today I am over the top excited to introduce you to my guests. Thank you so much for coming. Sonia and Michelle are friends of mine, but also super smart and in touch with what's going on in today's world. So for the purpose of today's episode, which is patriarchy and the period, I thought that you two would be amazing guests. And because you're so astonishing in your accomplishments, I don't think I could memorize what it is that you do. So maybe you could introduce yourselves to our audience today.
So I'm Michelle Hamilton Page, and I've been in Victoria probably for 5 years now, and I am associate faculty and a postdoctoral fellow at Royal Roads University, working with Resilience by Design Lab there and focusing on climate leadership and BIPOC and queer communities.
Sonia?
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having us. Geez, I've been engaged, I'd say, as a political organizer, community builder for about 15 years. And that's put me in touch with election campaigns and at the national level and the provincial level. Today, I try to take all that and support social impact organizations to figure out how to make their mark in the world of advocacy.
Yeah. And you have also so graciously facilitated some of our menopause gatherings here in Victoria. But that's why I keep inviting into this podcast.
Why are you platforming Sonia again? Because we've done this work together for a bit.
We've been doing it together for a while. But I was really, Michelle, we've been talking for a couple of years now, maybe 2 or 3 years. And I've always wanted to get your perspective on, specific to our subject today, patriarchy and our approach to menses, your opinions, your thoughts, you know. So I guess that's where I want to start off with is how do you think the patriarchy impacts our relationship with menses, which menopause is a part of?
So I would say that there are a few things that we're looking at. We're looking at sort of healthcare, which I would sort of set aside as saying that's a specific conversation and a relationship between us and allied health professionals. And there are standards of care that are there. We can talk a little bit about lack of research. We can talk about some of the complexities around hormones and some of the reasons that we are given that happens. I would say we want to look at sort of socially what's happening within, from the perspective, a social perspective, patriarchy sits within other systems. So we're looking at what bell hooks would call the white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, I would add heteronormative, colonial systems that patriarchy runs through all of those.
Right.
It's complex in that we're talking about interweavings of systems of oppression. It's not complex in that when we're breaking it apart and having these discussions, we're talking about things like the social determinants of health or social location, right? So the way in which my identity or my social location sort of interlocks together from like an intersectional perspective has an impact on how I access care or how I perceive myself or how I am perceived within sort of social construction. When I'm teaching I teach in the disaster emergency management program, and we talk about the social determinants of health. It's how your race, class, your sexual orientation, your gender, your immigration status, your level of education, all those things impact our health and wellness. And so I am made up of these social locations within these systems that we just identified. And so what we're talking about is how we're impacted in our own social location within patriarchy, capitalism, a racist, white supremacist, heteronormative binarizing system. And so I would say the patriarchy has everything to do with how I perceive
I agree.
myself and how I access services, how I access care, and how I take care of my body within the cycles in social places, in public places, where things like bathrooms can be restrictive and can be politicized, specifically, and a policing place, women's bathrooms, when you're thinking about binarized gender. So we can talk a bit more about that and break that down. But I would say it has everything to do both with how I perceive myself, how I am perceived, how I access care, and all of the ways in which, I can't access things because there's a lack of research that allows me to make educated decisions around the cycles of my life, my cycle, because I just don't have the evidence to sort of draw on.
Right. And that's a big part of why we wanted to do the podcast, is to start expanding these conversations and sharing knowledge with our viewership and our listeners. The dropping of knowledge that we're going to have today is going to help other people to whoa, I never thought of that. Sonia, you and I talk a lot about the patriarchy and how it impacts us and the work that we do. Do you want to give me your overarching thoughts on how the patriarchy impacts our relationship to menses?
I experienced patriarchy shaping me even when I didn't have words for that. Starting when I first had menses. Are we using technical terms?
No, well,
that time I hid in the bathroom because I was living alone with my father.
yeah.
So that's kind of my first, I think, touch point with it was, on the one hand, wanting to become a woman, because I think by the time I started bleeding, it seemed, the male gaze was upon me already. Again, didn't have those words. I felt like in a hurry, in a way, to be a woman in the male gaze in a weird way. But boy, did I not know what I was getting into. Anyway, and then you come to learn that the male gaze doesn't really want to know that you're having a period. It doesn't really want to know that you're in pain. It doesn't want it to be talked about. Then we get into what I said earlier, the squeamishness of men and how we capitulate to that. I'm here today because Michelle, first of all, holds so much great space and a lot of the great thinking on this. I'm really here to talk about how the impact of hiding women and the impact of the shame and the lack of understanding and transparency and health research and all of those things that are, I think, a tool of patriarchy to hold on to power, is to try to cut off information, education. And I think the week that we're recording this in, we've just seen the re-election of what my mom calls the thing. God love my mom.
Yeah,
she's not super political, but she's like, the thing got elected. Even though I don't generally believe in dehumanizing folks. Yeah, and so I think that we're in a moment too at risk of things going, reverting back to a place of hiding and shame and fear. And so I'm appreciative of this conversation today.
I am too, in the sense that just when you're talking about the election, I think that this conversation today is extremely timely for our viewers. We are on the Saturday of the week that Donald Trump was reelected as the 47th president of the United States, which is horrifying to many, 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 many people, especially vulnerable folks. I'm in my 60s. Michelle, you're in your 50s. Sonia, you're in your 40s. What our experiences have been affected by the decades, if you will, right? And we've all had somewhat different experiences. But when you talk about your first cycle, being alone with your father and stuff like that, I think what I want to talk about and the silencing is the stigma that is attached to women bleeding, which in some cultures it's quite revered.
And to be clear, it wasn't my dad really that was imposing anything.
No.
It was just the broader, cultural narrative that I would already have been tapped into even before the internet.
I think our poor dads were what do
as
I do
ill-educated as we might have been.
Yeah, I know. I've been following what's happening right now with the 4B movement that is a South Korean movement, but now they're talking about it in the United States. And a friend of mine gave me a book a couple of years ago called The Amazons, which is about the mythology of the Amazonian women and, how they literally, there was No boys allowed. Excellent book. I recommend it. I am going to try and get an
Anthropologist?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I've been trying.
I think that's the next step on that. I think we're not the anthropologists, but the really good theme of it is like it matters what the power context is that the thing is happening in. And
I wanted to give a little bit of background for the viewers because my next segment, and I wanted to call it "We've Come a Long Way, Baby," but now have we? Because we're is misogyny and progressiveness like colliding? Like, are we on a collision?
Are we having a backlash?
Are we having a
there's always
collision course right now? Well, like what? Maybe we could talk a little bit about that in the context of menses and or not. What's going to happen?
I would love to talk about the backlash.
Exactly. And here's the thing, like pre-taping, we were talking about trying to inject hope and like the role of hope and how it sits in tension with the need to be real about where we are today. On that note, there's hope in women coming together if we need some
There's
hope.
hope in women talking.
But at the same time, we can't be complicit in this thought that once you've achieved something, some sort of measure of progress, as we call it, that it stays without vigilance. And
I agree.
I know we would love to get to a place where like we've won and now we get to not worry about, oppressive of female or just non-cis male bodies generally. But it's the front line has always been right there. Like we've never really gotten very far because culture takes a very, very long time to shift. And sometimes laws get ahead of culture and vice versa. And as I sometimes say, yay, we've been able to vote for a good century now, depending on your skin color. But nothing much has changed in any of these systems that are still all very governed by patriarchy. And we're finding it hard to even stay in these systems because they're not made for us. They don't meet our needs. They're all
Which is what the 4B movement is all
exactly.
about.
They're almost like going on strike. Like I'm going on strike from the romantic paradigm of patriarchy. What we're seeing now, and I think there's a bit of a tendency in Canada to get smug that, this won't happen here. But I am also, yes, I'm in my 40s, so pushing 50, but was a teenager with an unwanted pregnancy in a province where that wasn't accessible to me. So, I've never, I don't think, ever achieved that sense of we've won, now we can rest. There's always been a real close recognition that it's always at risk of being snatched away because equality feels like oppression to the privileged, which is kind of the world that we're sitting in right now. Is the Andrew Tates of the world think that they're oppressed.
I want to say that we're all a little bit shell shocked by this week. I think, Michelle, do you want to add anything to what we're?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking a little bit about our personal experience. So, in addressing the binary. So I'm someone who identifies as gender nonconforming, and certainly in seeking healthcare and trying to figure out what to do with a body that presents as female at the time, did that more so. Accessing service that's appropriate, that's gender affirming is one of those other things that's completely under fire. And there are provinces that are trying to legalize not just the access to care, but education around that as well.
Can I ask which provinces?
So Alberta right now is looking at legislation that will be addressing education, access to care, and sports around gender affirming care. New Brunswick does as well. Saskatchewan does as well. So and there are tons of legislation in the States, and we catch the cold that the U.S. has. Is like they sneeze and we get. And populism is on the rise as well, right? So this backlash against education, informed critical thinking. Some of that backlash is informed by policies that use rhetoric that actually don't address where we are within healthcare practices in Canada or education practices in Canada. And so they use rhetoric that creates an idea of truth coming from government that is not, in fact, the case. So what I would say is that the attacks on freedoms are generally what we're talking about. My choice, my body, my autonomy, and the freedoms around moving beyond just this idea of binarized gender and asking people to think complexly. It isn't difficult. It takes time. Again, I have a standard for healthcare providers, allied healthcare providers, and social systems that support them. And I have a standard around the social pieces. So sort of putting aside what the healthcare standard is, it's my body, my autonomy, my choice, my freedoms to have conversations with healthcare providers, with community, with family. And the same thing goes for youth as they are learning and trying to become who they are within education systems that support them to try things on in healthy ways, to discover who they are in supportive and healthy ways, and understanding that those patriarchal systems that we're talking about also exist in the home. So if I'm a youth who's trying to figure out who I am, and my background was I was adopted and raised by born-again Christians who are fundamentalists. And so I was coming of age and discovering who I was in a place where it was very clear that that wasn't welcome in my church, in my school, in my home. As I got into high school, that was a place where I could expand and be myself more than the restrictions at church, which was 3 or 4 times a week, or in my home. Oh, wow. The legislation isn't just around healthcare. The legislation is trying to legislate education. And that goes for all of the pieces we're talking around sexual health promotion or learning what a period is. Or if I was someone who was transitioning and deciding that I was trans and identifying as male, if I wasn't using blockers, or if I wasn't if I hadn't done a lot of change around the sort of what's happening hormonally in my body, I would also still be experiencing a period. So then as an educator, it's important to have these conversations in open ways that address the realities of what's happening with youth. And when we don't do that, when there is this flex of control and power that is taking autonomy away from youth, we do see suicide rates go up. So my whole baseline is we are just trying to get young people to the place where they're adults and can make healthy decisions in education, in homes, in communities where they can feel like they can speak their truth, they can learn, they can try things on, they can experiment and be supported to do that. So for me, it all comes down to freedom and control and governments trying to legislate us away from autonomy. And so this is really kind of this juxtaposition, because this right-wing populist fascist movement has adopted language and co-opted language around freedoms. And it's like, well, you're the most restrictive of policies and legislation that we can imagine. So yeah, I have huge concerns about where we are as Canadians. It's not just about what's happening in the States. I have huge concerns about the rise of populism as it impacts policy and legislation, for sure.
Which we're having this conversation on This Week in History, right? This is top of mind for us.
It also bears saying about patriarchy in the period and the abortion that I couldn't find in New Brunswick, that my doctor also refused to give me a birth control pill.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, yeah. And
He's an elder man at that time, so yeah.
And women physicians did those kinds of things too, right? I was with someone whose doctor refused to confirm they were pregnant, pushing the term. Yeah.
This is a long conversation that we're having today. And this always freaks me out when I say it, as the elder in the room.
I'm okay being
not that much elder. Let's be clear.
I like it. I mean, it's ironic. I am embracing getting older. I love being older, and we get to eat first. You know, what can I say? So I feel like we've come a long way. I feel like now we have free tampons. Oh my God. Like, do you know how expensive tampons were? Free contraceptive. It's like here in BC, and I believe it's going to be a national. Didn't they announce it? It's going to be federal too. When the tampons went into the men's washrooms on Parliament Hill, there was a huge, it made the news, right?
Backlash.
Yeah. We were talking about that.
Men are so emotional about such things.
What were you saying about it?
I mean, the concept that there's men's and women's bathrooms, there need to be gender neutral bathrooms.
But it doesn't have a men's and a woman's bathroom. Somehow we manage.
That's fantastic. For me, that also addresses some of the issue that I'm talking about in terms of bodies that have periods and cycles and not making assumptions. How is it our role as a community or society to look at someone to determine what bathroom they should go into, what access they should have to universal supports and systems of care? It is around control. It is not our role. We have progressed enough, I think, to have access to, the internet and ways of finding and learning critically and moving beyond these binarized, really simplistic ways of, I can look at you and determine what your sex is, that gender is not performative for absolutely everyone. I have a colleague who talks about the binary serves no one. It's not working for anyone.
Yes.
And I think that's brilliant. Shout out to SJ. I think that you see queer communities getting tagged with, this gender ideology term, and the reality is everyone's performing gender. I would love to see places that we, get rid of our bodily secretions, be, just things that work for everybody and that don't have to have gender attached to them. I also care about people feeling safe where they go. And I think single stalls are the way to go for that as well. And I think you have to have access to those kinds of supplies where people don't have to make a show of grabbing them and using them. So again, in those single stalls. But none of this is rocket science. Like it's not, and the rollback of the supports and the extension of control, that's patriarchal. And while we have come a long way, we also have a long way to go as white feminists to have this conversation around women of color and Indigenous women and colonizations and reparations and being colonizers. So yes, we have gained grounds in terms of having these kinds of conversations on public platforms. We can lose those grounds so easily and so quickly. And I think that's a big piece of it too, right? And how are we as community supporting each other and activists? We're talking about an election, but this has way more to do with what's happening at a community and a transformative solidarity level as we seek to support each other to continue to gain rights. The discourse around trans folks right now is the same discourse in the 70s and early 80s around queerness, around LGBT, or not even T, so gay and lesbian and bisexual rights. And so it's not new. As a community, we have ways of responding to it and need to support each other to do that. But none of this is new. We've been here before, but we've also lost rights before. We've also seen rights rolled back and are seeing that now in the U.S., which I think is why this is so concerning, that over half the population voted for the kinds of values that they voted for, it's not, we're out of the realm of microaggression. Now we're openly hearing white supremacist discussion. We're openly hearing about it's your body, it's my choice from the patriarchy.
So I think I touched on it earlier, but maybe we could talk a little bit about, because it is a very political week. I want to keep reminding our viewers of this because
the personal is political.
Yeah.
It is. It's always political. It's never stopped.
Yeah.
Can I just build on what she was saying though, around?
Can we interrupt you and have a
around, because at one point, I can't remember if it was you or you talking about how all this co-opting of language is happening, and this notion of gender ideology being a thing that trans folks inhabit, when patriarchy is a gender ideology. Like, we've always been living under an oppressive gender ideology system, but it's always favored and been built by a particular gender and a very narrow definition of it. And I think, and when I shouldn't say we, because in this case it's nobody's work here, but men haven't done the work of helping other men learn how to expand what the performativeness of maleness can look like. And we're seeing this backlash where not only are we seeing men use their power to re-narrow what gender means or what woman means, it's also re-narrowing what it means to be male. In other words, it's like, can we go back to the binaries? My brain can't handle complexity. I need the simplicity of this binary framework. And I'm not saying that to bring any sympathy to it, but to raise an awareness that is how deep the resistance to any kind of change is, right? Like, we're asking for just to loosen the grip of your gender ideology and the binarization, and whoop, there's like a whiplash, because whether we're talking about gender or race or class or anything, what's happening right now is power reasserting itself, right? It's all about patriarchal power reasserting itself, and it does that by keeping folks in a state of panic. It's the patriarchal way. And so you always need to be attacking something.
Pain, anger, panic, withdrawal. I would suggest it's white supremacist patriarchal power too, right? So again, like naming it within colonization. And what's interesting when you're talking about change, because you're saying like, we're asking for change. It's like, well, it's not change for us. Right. It's not change on our part. Like, we're not, none of this is news when you go back to, this is the information you either gain from, if you have a loving mother, sister, trans auntie, nibbling, who will talk to you about how to survive in this world. If not, you're getting it from community, or you're finding it on the streets, or wherever it is that you're finding it. But when you're part of groups that are not this white supremacist, male, cisgendered, straight, heteronormative world that Bell Hooks has been talking about forever, and we stand on the shoulders of those Black critical feminists that have named these things in ways that we're not asking for change. We're asking them to step aside and cede some of the, whatever it is, rights for legislation, healthcare, determination of ourselves, and through the kinds of systems like we're talking about with political power, they're saying absolutely not. And so this is a backlash. That is a backlash. And what was it? 52% of white women voted for Trump as well. We are at risk of this here.
I know.
And it is for these, but also for me, there is a grain of hope, is one of my favorite singers, Brandi Carlile, talks about when an animal is injured, they are the most dangerous. And so the ideas that we're talking about that are patriarchal and white supremacist and colonizers and all this stuff, it is being threatened. And therefore, they are at their most dangerous. And that, for me, is hopeful, that in that threat, that these ideas have gone somewhere to die. And that is in our thinking and our practice of trying to get outside of the patriarchal stuff, that's the white supremacist stuff, that actually acknowledging race and racism that's internal as we work as communities to organize and move beyond that. It's threatening. That's the change, that we want to be, that we're, I think, striving to be. That is threatening is hopeful.
You know what? Thank you for saying that, Michelle, because the one quote that has been just like in my brain all week this week is from Malcolm X, and he says, "Anger is a gift." And that is what propelled me when I was working on a campaign many years ago. I was very angry about something. It had a lot to do with our friend Stephen Harper. And I was so angry about it that I became I wasn't letting go. And we ran a very, very successful campaign because I was fueled by anger. And I think that Brandi Carlile, amazing artist, musician,
she was talking about it between singing "We Are the Champions" and another song at the Gorge.
You were at that big concert.
I was at the big concert. But you know what? I want to say this to the anger piece. I think we also need to keep in mind that 93% of Black women voted for Kamala Harris and did not vote for Trump. And very often in our whiteness, we can be comfortable with our anger, but we need to be very open to and supportive of spaces where, women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, and beyond that, beyond women, our non-binary and trans community will be angry and check, whatever happens for us around white supremacy and being like, there's not a space for that. That's psychologically unsafe for me. And check our own reactions as white allies in saying, you have every right to be angry / if underneath that is fear and anything else that you're not going to name to me and you shouldn't have to name to me. You can just be angry, because that is also all of this is political. All of these personal pieces that we're talking about, including your period, menopause, getting support for, in my case, fibroids, the need for a hysterectomy, figuring out how that would change my orgasm, change my body. I couldn't get access to that information except for like websites like the Hister Sisters. So where there isn't research, where there isn't evidence that's in a peer-reviewed journal that I can fall back on, because our bodies are complex, because we have hormones, because it takes more work, because that requires more funding, because men are in charge of research and dollars. All of this is political. So my body is political. My experience is political. I'm not politicizing it. I'm exposing these things as a part of the politics of everyday life and systems of oppression, really.
Yeah. Sonia?
Well, I'm grateful for that thinking on the hope piece around almost a darkness before the dawn.
Yeah.
It reminds me of in election campaigns when you're being ignored, it's because you're not a threat. And then when the opposing campaigns come at you, it's because you're on the verge of taking power.
Yeah.
And they don't want that. And we were talking about toxic positivity earlier, and and we're trying to call in the fact that we're all, I think, white women in this room. And the reason I think I always bring up toxic positivity is like I have some penance that I'm doing because, I was a white woman wellness sort of hippie person at one point.
You were part of the wellness community?
I mean, no, I wasn't part of the wellness community. Arguably, I don't know if I've ever been, I've been moving around my whole life. What I mean is I espoused some of that,
Oh, I see.
I took on, I don't know that I ever tilted into toxic positivity because this is where my intersectionality helps me. And I grew up poor. I think the more you're in touch with oppression, the less susceptible you are to adopting the wellness toxic positivity stuff because you're a little bit more in touch with suffering. So that's one of the ways that I think we need to be mindful of it is it shows up in trying to police feelings and govern who's allowed to be angry and in what ways and civility politics and pearl clutching are ways that white supremacy asserts itself in conversations all the time. It's like
civility politics. And at the same time, that's the most uncivil election. And again, this is a piece of it.
Certain
right?
people
Where
have to be civil, not everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we are talking that there are massive, massive problems. What we're talking about, all of these things, like we should be talking about this a lot more. And that's where the power is in the communication.
And the organizing.
And
who's at the table and who's not at the table. And what voices are still being excluded and or not venerated. And venerated, is that a word? Venerated?
Yes. Yeah. It's a word.
It is
I think
now.
it's appropriately used for whatever it's worth. Uplifted, like it's kind of like how I make my decisions around who I follow on the internet. I like deprioritize who already is
absolutely
taking up all the damn space.
We're going back to B4, 4B, which is now 7B, because now they're suggesting that you don't even talk to men on the internet.
Well, here's the thing, like as though that were even possible. Oh, on the internet. Okay.
On the internet. I mean, I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole, but I do.
Their periods are political and patriarchy runs politics and
medicine and
runs everything. Runs finance, runs education, runs media.
I want to talk about the existing problems with regards to not patriarchy, because that is like that's just too much, right? Sorry. I want to talk about what we can do. So that's why I'm going the gathering, the sharing of the information. Like, what can we do to start solving these? Maybe make it all about, it's all inclusive, right? So,
well, I'm an educator, and I think I come down to being very clear that we have seen the education system gutted in the U.S., and that's a part of what's happening, right? So that where we see in some places where health and education policy are synced up, that we see that that there are positive social gains in those places. I would suggest that critical thinking needs to be one of the things that we're looking at and talking about openly with each other. I think it's interesting that people are looking to South Korea. Those are women of color that are having that response or have had that response. I think we need to be doing what I would suggest is what we call collective praxis, where we're doing our own self-reflection on our own social locations, how we are buying into systems of oppression. Again, going back to Bell Hooks's identifying the white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist, colonial system, and how are we benefiting from that, either consciously or not. That's part of our own self-reflective practice. And then looking to counter those systems of oppression, starting with self. And so I'm certainly part of a group that's doing place-based sort of hyper-local organizing across movements. There's an amazing book out called Solidarity by Astrid Taylor, who was one of the Massey lecturers.
Oh, I love her lectures.
She's amazing. So she's one of the co-authors. And it talks about building bridges across movements and looking at what that will do for us moving forward and moving from reactive solidarity, which we've seen this campaign do as it binarizes us and polarizes us, and be aware of that. I'm seeing a lot of that in my algorithms, specifically around women of color who are like, we understand what you're trying to do and we won't rise to the bait. We'll continue to move forward the way that and organize as we are. I
like that.
That for me is, I think, where hope lies and where I wouldn't say there are solutions, but I would certainly suggest that, I know the Obama campaign and then their administration, they had a practice that I know of, and I think it's probably true, where in the room, women of color would speak first when there was dialogue or discourse happening, people of color next, and then other folks next, right? So Indigenous Black, totally. Indigenous Black, people of color coming forward with worldviews that are not the dominant, seeking to maintain this power and control. We're talking about worldviews. So there are practical ways I think we can organize and are organizing. We've got a meeting in 2 weeks coming up. I could say more, but certainly
I
within.
love it. Listen, I've been writing them down. I've got 6 right now.
Yeah, so I would say if people.
Judeo-Christian too.
Yeah, I would say if people haven't read Vanessa Andreotti, if they're not looking at the polycrisis, and that's really what we're talking about, is the polycrisis, and we're not looking at it from a perspective that looks at what we need to hospice, ideas that we need to let go of as communities, and that when we talk about things like climate anxiety, often we're talking about that sort of white supremacist notion of not knowing how to handle a coming apocalypse, whereas there are communities like Black communities, a queer community that have lived through an apocalypse before and are rolling up their sleeves and being like, okay, how do we get organized? What do we do about this? So I would suggest that those people that are coming into power and are going to dominate media and be loud aren't the voices where we're going to find solutions, and that it's going to be hyperlocal. It's going to be looking to
It's definitely going to be hyperlocal.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think when we're asking for solutions, I think less of an outcome and more around how we're operating at this point. Because when you're campaigning or joining something in solidarity, there's certain things you can control and certain things you can't. And I think when you're overly concerned with the things you can't control, you're kind of limiting your ability to engage with like your own personal theory of change and try to figure out what is it that I can be doing that can, first harm reduction, first do no harm. And there's some things that come to mind, I think, is obviously harm reduction methods, but I also think about the practice that you described around what is often called a progressive speakers list, or just generally recognizing that not only do we need to be prioritizing voices that have been deprioritized for a long time, we need to actively be building, like recognizing that in dialogue spaces and in leadership spaces, that equity looks like overcompensating for underrepresentation, right? Like if we've been mostly listening to platforming, venerating, and taking the direction of a certain gender and a certain racial profile or class profile, all those intersections, recognizing that a lot of what we need to do is as white people in this movement space and working and trying to build bridges is to decenter and deprioritize our own voices, which can be really counterintuitive if you're an activist, right? Because you just want to squawk. But recognizing that the role is actually to make space for other folks and take direction from other folks and be willing to roll
I'm
up the
definitely
sleeves.
going to incorporate that progressive speakers list because we're going to be hopefully doing a campaign that will be a national campaign, and I think that is brilliant. Thank you for sharing.
We need
that.
a platform and center those voices at the beginning. I work with so many movement spaces or projects and organizations that 6 months, a year, sometimes into an endeavor, they're like, oh, how do we diversify the endeavor? And it's like, well, the DNA is already flawed, so hospice it, sunset it. In fact, there were so many movement spaces, is unpopular to say, but like nonprofits, and that really probably should be thinking about ways to decenter or sunset what they do and make space for new ways of doing.
I'm going to refer back to my notes because I think we've expanded our conversation today a lot, and I'm really appreciative of that. We're at a point in history right now. I don't want to get emotional, but
It's an emotionally welcome space.
yeah.
and an emotionally charged time.
Yes.
Like I had a cry walking the dog this morning because there were a few things that sort of came into my field of vision about who's at risk. That just for me,
gosh.
we have to mourn.
Yeah.
It's only this week. It hasn't been a week yet. So I think that's part of it too, right? And at the same time, it's such a flawed, like the system's flawed, right? We're talking about empire. Like it's not in no way.
An empire in collapse.
Totally. In no way. And also have that on the, the back burner too. But it was who's going to be in power, and it is here, who's going to be in power, who we can work with to keep pushing to challenge these systems. So sorry, I spoke when you were...
No, it's
having a
okay.
moment there.
Thank you. I was about to break into
Well, and that's fair. I think that I like honestly, yeah.
But what I was gonna say, but this is why we're doing this, like getting organized. in
being
the
really intentional, I think, about not recreating the systems or not mimicking the systems that are
That got us to this place
exactly
of polycrisis.
yeah. So that's why I was going to get emotional. Is I'm like, that's why we're doing this podcast.
Of course.
To keep people talking and to create conversations, because hopefully our viewers will then, go and get on the phone with, their next door neighbor or their whoever and say, do you know what I heard about yesterday? And then I Googled it, and then I learned more. There are sentences that can change your life.
Well, I know this is probably even more of a veer off of patriarchy and periods, but I keep thinking of my 22-year-old cisgendered, very tall son. So like all these intersections of privilege, and him coming to me. He's been devastated this week, actually. And coming to me, and he's like, Mom, and he's nowhere near these rabbit holes, but I don't think people have any idea the information environment that's coming at people like me nonstop. And then there isn't this alternative. And so there's an element of what we can do to try to build solidarity in the non-man world. And at the same time, there's a call to action here of like, men, take care of your own. Like, men, give an alternative to these current, manosphere powers, because it is the cultural information space right now that is the bulwark of this power shift. And it's been in the making for decades. It's not accidental. So even though, yes, sort of put energy in things and what grows, like one of the things I struggle with in the movement space, what we're not accomplishing is creating a similar information and environment for folks, and here's the thing, because we're always talking about like YouTube stars and these sort of viral digital sensations, what we don't often see is there's a lot of on the ground work happening, and that's where the seeds are being planted and they're being mobilized, and the reason I think it's important to bring in organized religion as one of the patriarchal systems that we're thinking about is like a lot of this stuff is happening in churches, if not church itself. A lot of these groups like anti-SOGI activists are like organizing in churches. And if we're not
define
starting...
SOGI,
sexual orientation and gender identity studies. Yes. Which, by the way, when I was having that first period living alone with my dad, thank God for SOGI type education, because that was my antidote. And I wasn't, in a space of being challenged with my, like I was gender normative. All to say that if we're going to actually resist power, we really, really need to stop relying on the digital space.
Thank you, Sonia. That's great.
And really, really need to be on the ground organizing. I don't want us to abandon and seed the digital space, but we would do really well to try to seed really back to the basics on the ground organizing.
I call it boots on the ground. You've got to have boots on the ground.
Wearing boots today.
Yes.
Yeah. There is that. There is also, I would say, in those hype, like around sort of, we're binarizing, we're talking about men too, but it's like, go to the drag queens, go to the trans folks, go to the folks who are challenging those hyper masculine spaces and what it is to be male, what it is. And again, the binary is not working for anyone. So I would love to see, the concept of men troubling gender as part of how we got here in a big way, right? And I agree with you around religious institutions and including those within systems of oppression and what they stand to lose. But again, that critical thinking around who is supporting this, where is it coming from, following the dollars, that it comes back to capital, it comes back to, and religion does too, very often, it just comes back to capital, right? So while we have been far ranging, I don't, like when you're talking about the patriarchy and hormonal cycles or the body or embodiment or how my body is messy or stigmatized or complex or what is enacted or what is socially constructed, all of those pieces are entangled and complex, and yet it all is just us. Like, and if we take the time to, instead of thinking, queer people have sexual orientation and gender identity, as opposed to cis heteronormative people do as well. But that's the issue. If you stop and you challenge, behind gender nonconforming being an issue is that everyone has to look at the fact that, I also have this identity. Oh, maybe it's not as simple. Maybe I'm enacting a heteronormative masculinity, but maybe I'm not exactly that. Maybe I'm attracted to this other thing. And so this is, again, for me, where there's hope, where you're hanging on to those ideals pretty hard in this, whether it's religion or religious institutions that are propping that up, or systems that are trying to make education systems less progressive or inclusive or equitable. There is hope for me that there is a strong movement, and this could potentially be a last gasp, but that we've got to do our own work to look at how we got here, and that these systems that we've named are part of the problem. There are other, outside of those colonizing systems, ways of thinking, knowing, and being that I think, we need to be turning our attention to, and making sure that we're, as you say, seeding, and I was hearing it as the seeding with an S as opposed to the seeding with a C. I was like, oh yeah.
I did use both.
Yeah, totally. Within our privilege.
It'll serve us better too.
Totally.
It's like the liberatory framework and applying it to
in this white conversation. When I say we, right? Like I'm locating us within. I'm locating within that my own white privilege and my own position. But there is a role for us to be sure that we're seeding the microphone or seeding the spaces and.
I think that's something I've really taken away from this conversation. And I'm looking forward to having so many more people on the couch and at the microphone sharing all of these different perspectives. I am especially thankful for this conversation today. The timing of it was just, I knew I was going to get emotional today. So I want to leave on a hopeful note. I also want to thank you both for just being so 100%. I don't want to cry again, but thank you. Just thank you for being here today, because our time is up. And I want
grateful to meet you, Michelle, very, very much.
Yeah. We're going to stay in touch.
Walking away with lots.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah,
I want to thank our audience too for just sharing this time with us. We're coming to you from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, and the awesome House of Owl. Thank you so much for joining us today.